Welcome back to Outside Views. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for in-depth analysis on Brexit and UK politics. But let's get into today's topic. Has the world changed so much that joining the EU again is now inevitable? Are the actions of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump forcing the UK to reconsider its place in the world? Well, let's break it down. We live in a world that is shifting rapidly. Geopolitical competition is at its highest level in decades. And for Britain, this is a moment of reckoning. The international order that the UK helped build after World War II is being tested like never before. The post-war system was built on alliances, institutions, and the rule of law. But today, authoritarian powers are trying to reshape the world in their image. Vladimir Putin's Russia has spent years destabilizing democratic nations. His military aggression has been clear since 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia. And then came Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But Putin's war is not just fought with tanks and missiles. It's also fought through cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and political interference. And Brexit was one of his greatest victories. The UK's decision to leave the EU served Putin's interests perfectly. It weakened Europe, it divided the West, and it distracted the UK and EU from the bigger threats in the world. While European nations should have been focused on countering Russian aggression, they were instead bogged down in Brexit negotiations. And the Kremlin's fingerprints are all over this. Russian interference in Western elections has been well documented and the UK was not spared. Brexit created division, dysfunction and a distraction from the UK's real strategic interests. And then there's China. Xi Jinping has been reshaping China's role in the world. China is expanding its influence not just in Asia, but across Africa, Latin America and even Europe. Through economic coercion, aggressive military posturing and strategic alliances, Beijing is challenging the Western-led global order. China has been deepening its relationship with Russia as well. The two authoritarian states are working together to undermine democratic nations. And while the UK once had a privileged position in global trade, Brexit has made it harder to stand up to these challenges. The UK lost its seat at the EU's trade negotiations table. It lost access to the collective power of the world's largest economic bloc. And instead, Britain has had to negotiate trade deals from a weaker position, and that's what they look like. And that matters when competing against China's economic might. Being outside the EU makes the UK more vulnerable to China's pressures. And then there's Donald Trump. Trump's first term showed us what happens when the United States disengages from its global responsibilities. His America First policies undermined NATO, weakened US-European cooperation, and emboldened authoritarian leaders. And now, with Trump back in the White House, the UK is facing even more uncertainty. Trump's approach to international relations is purely transactional. He sees alliances not as partnerships, but as deals to be renegotiated. If Trump turns his back on NATO, Europe will need to take more responsibility for its own defense. And where does that leave the UK? Outside of the EU, Britain is not part of EU defense structures. Without the US fully committed to NATO, the UK's security strategy becomes far more complicated. And this is why the question of joining the EU again is becoming more urgent. The UK is more isolated now than at any time since the 1940s. It has left the largest and most successful economic and political union in modern history. And now, as the world becomes more dangerous, Britain finds itself with fewer allies, less influence, and more challenges. Brexit was sold on the idea of sovereignty, taking back control. But in a world dominated by superpowers, sovereignty means very little without influence. Sovereignty does not mean strength if it leads to isolation. And Brexit has left the UK with less influence than it had before. The EU is pushing ahead with major security initiatives. It's launching an €800 billion rearmament program. It is strengthening its internal energy security. It is becoming a more powerful actor on the world stage even. And the UK is on the outside looking in. Some argue that the UK does not need the EU, that it can forge its own path, that Brexit Britain can make trade deals with the rest of the world and build its own alliances. But where is the evidence that this is working? The much-promised UK-US trade deal never materialized. The trade deals the UK has signed with other countries have been, at best, marginal improvements over what it already had an EU member, or they even got worse. Meanwhile, British businesses are still struggling with the economic damage caused by Brexit. Trade barriers have increased, investment has fallen, and the UK economy is growing more slowly than its European neighbours. And beyond trade, there is the issue of regulatory influence. The EU continues to set global standards in tech regulation, finance and environmental policies. The UK, once a major player in shaping those rules, now finds itself in a position where it must follow decisions made in Brussels without having a seat at the table. The reality of Brexit is setting in, and it is becoming clear that the UK's global standing has been weakened. So what happens next? The world is realigning. Putin's Russia is more aggressive than ever. Xi's China is reshaping global politics, and Trump's America is unpredictable and unreliable. And Britain must decide where it stands. Joining the EU again is not just about economics. It's about security. It's about being part of a community of democratic nations that can stand together against authoritarian threats. It's about ensuring that Britain is not left behind as the world changes. The EU is not perfect. No institution is. But it is a powerful bloc that can defend its interests in a way that individual countries cannot. And as the world becomes more dangerous, being part of the EU may no longer be just an option, it may become a necessity. Joining the EU again will not happen overnight. You know my series on that. It will take time. It will require political leadership that is willing to make the case. And it will require public support. And it will require support from the EU and the member states. But the conversation is changing. For years, the idea of joining again was dismissed as unrealistic. Now it's becoming a serious topic of discussion. Because as the world changes, Britain must adapt. And if it wants to protect its interests in the decades ahead, returning to the EU may be the only logical path forward. So what do you think? Has Brexit left Britain too isolated in an increasingly dangerous world? Has Putin, Xi and Trump made rejoining the EU inevitable? And do you think the UK will eventually find its way back into the European Union? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And I know that some of my viewers say that the EU won't let them in. It will not be easy. It will not be an easy thing to convince the political class in Britain to ever attempt that. And it will not be easy to convince all 27 member states in the EU to do that and allow that, especially with Orban and his quite very close to Putin stand, because Putin will not want the UK back in the EU. But with all the really harsh things happening since the Brexit vote, we really have to take a step back and take some not too subjective view of what is happening on this planet. And then you might want to start thinking that direction as well, thinking it over at least. And that's what I'm doing in my videos, giving you options, giving you some paths that are possible, maybe not probable, but possible, and what that would mean. That's why I also did that 35 chapter series about the accession process. In this changing world, from no side, from the Brexiteer, from the Remainer side, from the UK side, from the EU side, with everything happening right now, we should never say no. And I'm not James Bond. But if you want to see another video, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.